Between the Listening and the Telling, How Stories Can Save Us, Mark Yaconelli.
My friend Mark Yaconelli has written an amazing book that is launching today called Between the Listening and the Telling, How Stories Can Save Us. I've known Mark for a couple decades and then some now as a community organizer, a community activist, and a man who works with people in matters of repair and justice and healing. This book is about the ways that we can each learn to facilitate storytelling in our families, in our communities, in our own lives as a way to find out who we really are and why we're even here. It's a book that makes me laugh out loud sometimes, and it brings me to tears. I think you're going to love it. Hi, Mark.
Hi,
It is so great to be here with you today for the launch of this beautiful, beautiful book on how stories save us called Between the Listening and the Telling. We go back a long ways.
Mm-hmm.
The first time I really remember you was when Sam, whose studio we're in right now, Square One Studios, was in your Sunday school class at St. Andrew, and this is 20 plus years ago. And we've been really good friends ever since.
Yes.
And we've helped each other a lot with our writing because one of us will be stuck and blanking out on what this means, what that means, or how you could try to capture how spirit works, how love is transmitted in a way that's not sentimental, and you gave me that great image of the octopus teacher when towards the end the octopus comes and just plants himself on the chest of the man who had been so depressed, which to me is probably the purest visual I've ever seen of love. Love as the energy of which we're made and that we're made for. And so you mean a lot to me, and I can't wait to foist this book on everyone. I wonder if you could tell us off the top of your head about this book.
Well, first of all, this book comes from a life. It's sometimes there's books that, we have a great idea or a beautiful set of images and we put those down. This book comes out of, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of interactions with people and their stories, and sometimes with whole communities. And sometimes in particular moments, like a community in trauma after a school shooting, or undocumented people in Austin right after Donald Trump was elected and there was a lot of fear there, or working with climate change activists who are just in despair and trying to find a way to use story in a way that is healing or liberating or connecting or sustaining. The Irish say that if you run out of food and water, you can always live off stories. Mm-hmm. And so I've found that can be true. I mean, if you have the right story, it can draw forth parts of ourselves or parts of the universe that keeps us alive. So I've been trying to work with this sort of transformational aspect of story. And after doing that work for 10 years, I thought, there's something here that I want to communicate through writing and through the book. So the book comes out of this work.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I wondered if you might read a couple paragraphs so people can hear it in your own voice.
So this is on a chapter when I tell my own story. Within the catacombs of the soul are sacred paintings, captured memories that hold the emotional truths at the root of our being. Throughout our lives, we find ourselves contemplating these layered images in search of greater understanding, each icon a window into some unique tension we've lived but can't fully integrate. When asked about our lives, we become a docent within our own inner museum, standing before various exhibits, describing what we see, working to put them in some sort of order that might make sense to others, to ourselves. The arrangement depends on the question and the storyline we're following. Betrayals, childhood courage, natural disasters, close calls, sacred objects, adventures in sex, rites of passage, mother, father, home. Images are gathered and lined up according to theme. But when the telling is over, the museum closed, the lights turned off, our memory simply hangs silently within the body, often without any arc or purpose, waiting to be rearranged for the next telling.
Well, that's beautiful. How do community storytelling retreats and evenings heal people? How does that work?
Well, so stories is kind of magic that we all have access to. You know, Colin McCann's storytelling is the great democracy, and it's something we all know how to do. Even when we're little, we can form these stories. And when we do it in community, when we do it with others, the magic of it is, if I tell the story well, if I pay attention to the body, I tell you what I saw. You know, there was growling in the bushes. I was scared. I didn't know if it was a dog or something larger. You know, I start describing it like that. What happens to the listeners is we get transported through time and space, and we're there with you. We're in the bedroom at 6 years old, and there's something large outside the window, and there's a growling, and we're scared, but we don't want to call for our mom because she gets angry at us every time we call for her. You know, we feel the whole thing, and we start creating it in our heads, like the bedroom, the bed, the darkness outside, the sounds. And so what neuroscientists call this is transportation. We're transported through time and space, and we're all there as you're telling the story, right? And when they put those little wires on our brains and they watch them, what happens as the story moves on is our brains go in sync. So when you're scared, I feel that tension. And when you're relieved, I feel that release. And it's a kind of communion, right? We're all sharing this story together, and we're in that space together. And not only do I feel your life and a little bit of understanding of what it's like to be you, but I also see myself in you. And that's a really beautiful moment, because what if you're a red hat and I'm a blue hat? You know, what if you're somebody really different from me? But I just saw myself in you. That creates a kind of intimacy and connection that, well, can do all kinds of things. It can be healing. It can help us give each other a little more room and space when we're trying to address a problem in our community. I'm going to be less likely to discard you or stereotype you. So in community, when we tell stories in that space, we actually get these little glimpses, little moments when the differences fall away and we feel our common humanity. And that's what story can do. And everybody can, it's incredibly accessible. You know, that's what's beautiful about it.
But how does you going to a community or through this book teach people how to tell stories as a kind of makeshift storytelling guild? How does that help in any way with global warming activists who feel completely defeated right now?
Yeah.
How does storytelling help us save the world?
Well, so you brought up climate change, you know, so Thich Nhat Hanh says that the worst thing that can happen to a human being is despair. Yeah. And so when you talk about climate change, you talk about, we feel the edges of absolute despair there. So story, when I've worked in those communities, works a couple ways. One is when we come together to start the day, you know, as a staff, or before we're going to do a protest, or as we're going to do some kind of scientific analysis of what's happening to the frogs in Rogue Creek or something like that. We tell stories together. And the stories might be, what gave you life yesterday? Or did you notice anything beautiful when we were walking the creek yesterday? And we tell those moments. And what's beautiful about story is that stories are full body meaning making. So stories bloom in the body. So when you tell me about walking the creek and seeing the spring flowers, I start to see it. I start to feel the peacefulness. I start to imagine the birds and the trees. And my whole body is sort of refreshed and renewed in that telling. And then we go around the circle and everybody tells a moment of beauty that we had yesterday. Wow, we took that in. We took that moment in together, and we're kind of in that space. All right, now let's talk about what's happening to the frogs. Mm-hmm. And we have a little food and sustenance instead of just going into the hard problem. So sometimes just working in intimate spaces with people where they can see that there's a way of interacting where we can fill one another up, and we can touch into something larger than ourselves. That's one way. The other way is stories move people emotionally. So they're emotional kind of communication. It's the way we transfer emotions. And when I've worked with these scientists, you know, they're giving a lot of facts, right? But we also need the stories that help us move us to action. So one of the things about stories is every story invites a change or an action in me, whether it's a new understanding, maybe it's just of you, or maybe it's of girlhood, because I don't know what that's like, or maybe it's of the Northwest, I don't know, but it invites some kind of action. So having these scientists not only give the facts, but tell the stories where I feel their heart, their passion, their concern, their fears, that can move my body emotionally to do something. Mm-hmm. And that's what we need more of.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Also, it can help us get our sense of humor back, which is the greatest miracle of all. When we go from clenched and depleted, like you were really addressing just then, but when we go from clench and deadly seriously to getting our sense of humor back, it's like a spring rain.
Yeah, it is. You know, in the Catholic Church, they believe that anytime you cry, you're very close to the divine. You're very close to the holy. Like that's a sign that God is with you, that you're crying, right? It's that release. I think it's the same with laughter. When laughter, that belly laughter that comes over you, is a grace and a release and a sign that you're in that thin place. Yeah.
And they whoever they are, also say that tears mean the icebergs are melting
Within us. Yeah.
And I wonder how, with a community where there's been a school shooting, or where a factory is closed, or where there's been a terrible division between the townspeople against one another, when you show up, or when someone you've taught shows up, how would you even know where to start the process? Well,
so story is a third place, right? So just backing up a little bit, we have different languages we use, right? So if you want to get the language of the intellect, we use academic language, or sometimes we use therapy is emotional language, and politics is the language of the will, or whatever. So story is the language of experience, or as a friend says, like when he's talking to me, he'll say, "Are you feeling me? Do you feel me? Do you feel me?" So story is the way we help people feel one another. So in a contentious part of a town, or where there's divisions or things like that, what's needed is for people to feel one another, right? Because instead of the image I have of you, I need to actually feel what's going on with you, which is probably wider and more interesting and more wonderful than how I picture you. So often I have to create third spaces. So instead of let's talk about our political divisions, let's tell stories about political divisions. That would be terrible. Instead, let's tell stories about food. Or let's tell stories about letting go, or let's tell stories about home. And as a community builder, what I want to do in those places is make sure I have a diversity of people telling those stories. So I'm addressing the divisions, but we're talking about what it was like to come home after I served my tour in Iraq, or come home after my first year at college when I dropped out, or come home after I found out my father had died. And these stories are told, and we see each other in that. And it's like, you're not going to believe this. I have a very similar story to you, not knowing that the two of us are on the opposite end of whether we should bulldoze the park or not.
Right.
But I'm going to give you a little more room.
Right.
When we talk about it, I'm not going to write you off.
Right.
Because I know what it's like to lose a father or whatever,
right.
That kind of thing.
Right.
Can I just give you an example?
Of course.
So we did this. I had a group of veterans. Okay, these are combat veterans. And they came to me saying, "Oh, you do all this story stuff. Would you do a story night with us?" Because nobody actually wants to hear our stories. The reason they let us on the plane first is so that we won't talk to them. The reason they say thank you for your service is another way of saying be quiet, don't talk. Right? Thank you. We don't want to hear any more. So I said sure. So we did this event, and one of the soldiers was going to tell a story. Said, "Do you know that if you're undocumented in this country, you can serve in the military, and we promise you." The country promises you can become a citizen after you serve your tours. And he says, "But I got buddies who still don't have citizenship." So we had them tell a story. Now, when that night we had all these veterans show up, we have a lot of red hats showing up, and then you have these soldiers telling stories. And at the very end, they didn't make it the point of their story, but at the very end, they said, "I still don't have citizenship. I was brought here at 1 year old. This is the only country I know." And I watched these men get up and go to those soldiers and say, "What do you mean you don't have citizenship? Okay, this is wrong." Now, if we had a night on immigration, we might have stayed divided. But once they lived through their fellow soldier, this comrade, and then heard the wrongness around the immigration issue, they were willing to cross how they normally might believe politically and do something different. That's what stories can do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, the title of your book, Between the Listening and the Telling, emphasizes listening. So how do people listen to one another, and how can they begin to hear?
Well, we're both parents, so we both know that most of life is about trickery and distraction. And so you have to create. Listening is the most important thing. If I notice, even in this interview, if I notice you're distracted or looking around, it just shuts down my talking. It shuts down the story. Yeah. And so if you're trying to talk to someone, and they're checking their phones. So you have to create. See, there it's happening. So you have to create listening spaces. So what I do in these events is, first of all, just make it known to everybody. Like, this is a gift. This is hard. They're getting up. These are not professional speakers. It's a community member telling a story, or if it's in a circle of people. And then I have very strict rules. So if people are telling stories in a circle, you're not allowed to ask questions. You're not allowed to comment, even if it's a positive comment. Even if you want to say, oh my gosh, I used to live in Oklahoma just like you. You can't say anything. So it kind of forces people to just sit there. Once they realize they can't talk, they have to pay attention because there's nothing else interesting happening. And maybe I actually listen to you in that moment. So the listening space is the most important thing, and you have to pay attention to that more importantly than the crafting of the story, actually.
How do you get kids and teenagers to begin to listen?
Same thing. So I did an event where we have these wildfires. I live in Oregon. They've gone up and down. In 2020, we had fires all across the state. So I worked in a school where a third of the kids were affected by fires. And this was during COVID. They brought them back for the first time. They all had these white beaked masks, and it looked like cockatoos walking around the school.
Oh.
And it was absolutely silent because they had to be, so it didn't feel like a high school. They had to be 6 feet apart, and I'd go into the classroom. And so we were asked, like, is there a way you could use story to get these kids connected, right? Because we know to reduce anxiety and depression, we need people. And we put them in circles, and we asked them questions like, you ever have a strange encounter with an animal? And what's a place you used to hide when you were young? And some of the stories were scary, and some of them were funny, and they started kind of laughing and talking together. But we had strict rules, where all you had to do was listen. What we found out, over a week, we moved into stories of, what's a struggle you've had this, a little harder stories, a struggle you've had this last year. Some of the kids were living in cars or living in motels and stuff because of the fires. And I remember this big kid, 6 foot tall, Seattle Seahawks jersey, standing up. And I said, what was it like to tell stories of struggles? And he said, every story was depressing. And I said, yeah. And he said, and that makes me joyful. And I said, why? He said, because I could feel myself in every story.
Yeah.
And it's that young people, yearn to connect to others. And so I find telling stories with kids incredibly joyful, pleasurable, and that there's an unmet longing that shows up in that space.
Well, you write in the book, we tell stories to keep our souls intact when suffering overtakes us. How is the story part of the healing process when suffering overtakes us, when sometimes it's really all we can do to more or less get through one day at a time? When we don't have the energy, like you think about brushing your teeth when you're in despair and you think, God, that sounds like a lot of energy. How does the story create energy? Let me read it again. It's very beautiful. We tell stories to keep our souls intact when suffering overtakes us. Talk to me about that.
Well, so the soul speaks in stories, right? The soul speaks in images and stories. It doesn't speak in abstract principles.
What do you mean? It speaks in stories?
I mean, if I'm willing, if I feel safe enough to tell you what's really going on, I'm going to start handing you some images. It's kind of like that reading I did. I'm going to start showing you these pictures of things. Maybe they're disturbing things, maybe they're beautiful things or helpful things. But if you're listening really well, I'll say, I was in the grocery store yesterday, and I was supposed to bring back all this stuff that we needed for my daughter's graduation party. And I just started crying uncontrollably, My daughter was graduating. It didn't hit me during the ceremony, but it hit me in the grocery store, And I'm kind of telling you this place I'm in, right? I start telling you images because I want you to feel that with me, or I'm trying to feel it. So I'm bringing it up from the depths, from the surface, So the way that suffering the way that stories can sort of keep us intact is, a lot of our pain is from self-alienation or being,
Right.
disconnected from ourselves or disconnected from others or disconnected from the earth, right? So when I start telling the story being in the grocery store and crying uncontrollably, it's like, okay, there I am. That's me. I'm really sad that my daughter's graduating, And now I'm telling you, and you're mirroring back to me, you're feeling it too. You're like, oh gosh, Mark, she's going to be okay. You're going to be okay, but whatever. And now I'm connected to that. And so that's a source of healing, and it's sort of an anchor. So these two, they did these research on like what would predict, which measurement would predict whether a young person would survive an at-risk environment. And they used Myers-Briggs and the Minnesota whatever personality test. And they had one researcher who used stories, would meet with the kids and say, do you know any stories? Do you know what's the story of your name, or your birth story, or how your parents came to this town? It turns out none of the psychological tests could predict which kids would make it and which kids wouldn't out of a very troubled or difficult environment, except for stories. If they knew stories about their history and their life, those kids most likely were going to make it. And it's for two reasons. One is somebody took time to tell them the stories. So stories are relationship. So if I know the story and my mother told me the story, then that bond, every time I revisit that story, I feel that relationship.
It's a kind of collagen.
Yeah.
Right? It's connective tissue.
It's connective tissue, so it connects me to that. But then the stories of how my relatives came from Italy, and I know those stories about how they were immigrants and they were poor and they were musicians and they tried to make it work that way. Or my grandfather who had a vacuum cleaner store that failed, but he called the debtors and said, I'm not running, I'll make sure I pay everything before, and I did, he would finish that story. I paid every debtor I owed. You're brushing your teeth and you're feeling like it's all over, but the crying, and you remember your grandfather. And you remember your mom when she said, it was just me and 3 kids. Nobody was helping me. I had to work and take care of you. And you think, okay, that's in me. That's my part of my story. That's the soul, the deeper truths. And the story can hold that for us and bring it into our bodies as we tell it. And so we feel that strength and oh, yeah, I'm a Yaconelli.
Yeah.
I can do this.
Well, in the book, you call yourself a dream catcher, a story catcher.
Story catcher, yeah.
Tell me what does that even mean? What does that entail?
Well, so I worked in Austin, Texas, and I got to meet with all these undocumented folks. And the people who brought me in said, everyone's talking about immigration. No one's actually hearing the grassroots stories of the people involved. So I go out to meet with different people that I ran into. But if nobody asks us, if nobody's listened to us, we have these stories. It's like wallpaper. We have stories all over us, but we can't see them or feel them or read them, right? So a story catcher is someone who trusts you, who trusts that you have a story. And not only that, you have a story worth telling, and you have a story that's actually sacred, that could draw any of us in this room into some freeing truth that could bring us all into grace or bring us all into a sense of connection. And you have that. And I believe that of every human being. So if you believe that as a story catcher, then all I need to do is I just need to spend a lot of time with you, and ask you questions and listen and notice where the heat is. It's probably like that when you're working with people writing, right? And you're noticing when your heart leaps, or you're noticing. Can I give you an example?
Yeah.
I'm working in Wales for 6 months. There was a group that wanted to raise money for refugees. Calais, France had 5,000 refugees that were trying to get into the UK. And the news was calling this the jungle, and there was a lot of violence and stuff. And so these people wanted to tell stories. And there was a woman who had started a thing called Share, and she was raising money and clothes and all this stuff to send over to the refugees. So I met with her, and she wanted to tell her story. And for an hour, I'm asking her questions, and she's telling me about the organization and the principles and the politics, and I don't care, actually. I'm not that interested in all this stuff. I'm waiting for the story. And I said, yeah, but why did you decide to do this? And she said, well, I was on an elliptical, and I was looking through my social media, and I saw a little 2-year-old body that washed up on a beach on an island in Greece. I don't know if you remember this. It was a little boy, a little drowned little boy.
It.
And I just stopped and I said, I have to do something about this. And so I started this organization. Mm-hmm. Right, but that's not the story. So I said, okay, millions of us saw that picture. We didn't start organizations. Mm-hmm. Why did you start it? And, I could get emotional even think about it. I remember her leaning across the table and saying, because I know what it's like to lose a son. Mm-hmm. Now the story's in the room. Mm-hmm. Tell me about your son. And we hear the story of her son, and we hear the story of the community she grew up in, and the community of serving and helping, and all the people who helped her in that grief. And this is where this is coming from, right? And then we could bring that story together and birth it into the room, and then bring it into the community that needed to hear it. That's story catching,
But there's a dark side to stories too. Buddhists and therapists say that we can get trapped in our own stories, and that they can keep us from freedom and actually keep us in that separation from self, because we have gotten stuck in a story that we've told so many times that we no longer know for sure that it's true. So I wonder if you can maybe talk about the dark side of storytelling.
Well, again, this is where the listening is important, right? You're correct that I get stuck in a story that I tell about myself that could be really damaging or destructive. I could be stuck in a story I tell about you that's very destructive. And this is why listening is important. If I learn how to listen, you will tell, particularly to others around the circle, there are going to be stories that don't fit how I picture you or how I understand you, that's going to jar that loose and offer me a kind of freedom from the jail I've built around myself, and if you're listening to me, you also might, as I keep telling this story about myself, but I'm in a community of listeners, people are going to say, whatever happened to your sister? Or did you ever decide to take a job, And you're going to awaken other parts of myself. But this is why I call the book Between the Listening and the Telling. We have to be in a community of listeners. We're relational beings. And if we're not, it's in between us that freedom is found. Mm-hmm. And if I just stay in my story over here,
right,
then I'm trapped.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great. And then there's a cliche in recovery that if you want to heal it, you got to reveal it, and it's just so scary to take down the armor. And to our friend, Sam and my friend Duncan says, when you first meet me, you're meeting my bodyguard. And I think that's one of the truest things I've ever heard, is that you meet my persona and you meet my curated stories. You meet the stories I might share on Facebook, right? And so for you, for a story catcher, to say, well, let's go back. I want to hear more about the moment when you began crying on New Year's Eve because Sam was sharing stuff with you he'd never shared before, and it was really angry stuff. I want you just to talk to me. And and I could tell you the resolution, and it turned out to be the best thing to ever happen. And you go, thank you, thank you for sharing. But I want you to go back to when the story was being told, and so in story catching, you're also you're offering me a portal through this story to what really happened, and to why it's a story that can both connect us and free us from something we had decided on was the truth of our relationship, or the truth of what happened in the family, or whatever. That it's, the story can be a portal to actually not really knowing what happened, but you can capture one piece of it, and in capturing that one piece, little by little, you start finding out, another piece.
Yeah.
And it's putting together the mosaic chips when you don't when you're no longer going to tell the curated story that has a very nice beginning, middle, and a dynamite ending.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, so the soul will stay restless if you're telling an oppressive story about yourself.
Right.
The soul's not satisfied with that.
Right.
So the soul will give little clues that there's a deeper piece of music that wants to be played or heard. So sometimes, like when I'm working with someone, like they'll come in and they'll say, "Okay, I have this amazing story," and usually I know like this is not going to be the story, this is whatever, this is the persona or whatever,
right?
And so they'll tell the story, and then I just start poking around because the soul's trying to get out.
Yeah.
So if I ask you like, "Oh wow, that's an old car. Where'd you get that car?" "Oh, that car has been in my family for 2 generations, and I told my grandfather I wanted to have that. When he died, he gave it to my dad, and then it came to me." And you'll start to hear the real story that's trying to come out if you'll just take the time to listen more. And it's a more liberating, deeper, more beautiful story than we allow ourselves, right? We live in these small spaces to stay safe.
With bodyguards.
With bodyguards, and God bless them, and that's important. But we all have whatever you want to call it, Buddha spirit or, the indwelling Christ or whatever. There's a deeper aspect to every human being you meet. And if you'll take the time, you'll catch them. This quick image, my wife worked in residential treatment with abused boys who had been abandoned or taken from their families because they'd suffered abuse. They're like 8 to 10 years old. And I remember asking her, like, what do you do in that space? She goes, all I do is try to catch them being good. Because they had been trained, right, to cause people to treat them, to abuse them. So to people to yell at them, get angry at them, to act out. They were comfortable in that story of themselves. But every once in a while, someone would say, "Hey, do you want some of my Coke?" And Jill would pounce, "Hey, that's so nice of you to share your Coke. Tim, that was great. Hey, let me get you guys some cups, How great." To begin to mirror back a different story, a deeper story, the possibility that's in that human being.
That brings me to my next question, which is there's a chapter in the book on sacred stories. And I wonder if you could talk to us about how a story, whether it's you telling me a story or vice versa, or a community storytelling event or a retreat, how is that part of the spiritual process?
Well, first, and of course, this is just comes out of all your writing too. We're all on a sacred journey, so there's something. There's a deep dignity to every human being, and we're all a parable that reflects some deeper truth in some way. But nobody asks us about that. Nobody gives us any space to talk about that or to reflect on that. Sometimes I'm in a group. I mean, I've done this with a group they're dedicated to the eradication of superstition and religion. They're radical atheists, but they'd never done a retreat. So they asked me to lead a retreat as long as I would refrain from any crazy God talk. And, it's because they didn't know how to do the retreat. So I said, okay, I'll do the retreat. And they were trying to figure out what their mission was. And the first day I said, okay, I want you to all remember some moment in your life that was sacred to you. And I had to explain what I meant by sacred, where you were a deep experience of connection or joy or openness or freedom, but some moment that was sacred. So if I handed you a photo album that had a picture of every moment in your life in it, and you were just kind of flipping through, what images would come out as like, boy, that was sacred. And then I told them, okay, close your eyes. Now go back as if you could be there one more time. What do you see? What do you hear? What do you feel? And then I even pushed it to say, what is that sacredness like? Just sit in that for a little bit. And we had 5 minutes of silence. Every atheist told a story in the atheist club about these sacred moments. And when they got done, the gratitude, it's a relief to drop down into our deeper self. It's just a relief. It's like, thank God, I don't have to keep this other game going on. And I can just be quiet for a minute, and I can behold you, and you can behold me. And somehow between the listening and the telling, in the sharing, we dropped into the real. okay, now we got to go back. But we touched it for a moment, and hopefully it keeps you there. So that's what we can do when we tell these stories. That sacredness comes up. And then, of course, all of our wisdom tradition says, the only way I can explain this to you is I got to tell a story. Okay, there was a wood carver. He was out by a chestnut tree, and and we listened to the story. And what's beautiful is what stories can do is they can access parts of yourself that you don't know how to get to any other way. So I was working with some women who were working with abused teenage girls. And a lot of these girls were coming out of addiction. And they said, all we're asking them to do is tell the stories of their terrible families, their addiction, their suffering. How do we get them to access other parts? So we came up with story questions. Tell me about a time when you saw somebody else in residential treatment be kind. And they told all these kind stories. And what happens is kindness comes in the room. Like you tell me a story of kindness and she tells me a story. I'm feeling it in my body. You actually activated that part of myself. Tell me moment of bravery you've experienced in your life. I feel that bravery. Tell me a time when you were a kid and you did something creative, and I feel that creativity. You actually woke up that part of me just by telling the story. You
woke up something so real that had been asleep. You woke, the Greeks called God the really real.
Mm-hmm.
And so to elicit something that had been asleep or walled off in somebody does bring us closer to what I would, for shorthand, call God.
Yeah.
The great universal spirit or whatever. But because that deep truth inside of me is umbilical to you and to the really real and to Sam and to my community, that what's really real and to get to it is so rare in this culture, which is so based on appearance and curated visions of excellence and having it all together. And to say to somebody as person who's known as a story catcher, for someone to come to you and to say, do you have a minute?
Mm-hmm.
It's like a priestly moment for somebody to say, do you have a minute?
Mm-hmm.
And for you to say, yeah, what's going on? Tell me what's going on.
Yeah, and the thing is that every human being you meet, I mean, whether you're on a bus or family gathering or watching somebody walk across the street, they're hoping for a good question and a listening ear.
Yeah.
They're hoping for that. Mm-hmm. So sometimes, I was just at a restaurant a couple nights ago, and the woman serving us, and I said, so what's the dream? What do you mean? Like, what's the real hope that you're working towards? And she said, I want to be a writer. Mm. What are you writing right now? And she said, well, I tried all these works, but now I'm just working on writing my journal as honestly as I can. And what are you discovering? We had this amazing conversation. And when we left, she gave us desserts for free. Her way of saying, thank you for this gift, for asking me a good question and letting me talk about this part of myself that mostly is hidden. So anybody can do that, right?
Yeah.
We can all do that. We can all ask better questions and listen.
Yeah.
And it's and it brings our humanity into the room.
Yeah. So amazing when somebody, often tearing up, says, no one's ever asked me that before.
Mm-hmm.
I just have a couple more things. You claim every human being longs for a good question and listening ear, which is what you just said. And I remember years ago when I was teaching my youth group about Elijah, and I believe that God says to Elijah, why are you here? Mm-hmm. Right? And he's run from the terrors of Jezebel and Ahab, I guess, and you said, ask your children, why are you here? There were like 5 of them. I said, why are you here? Well, our mother dragged my mother dragged me here today. Well, I have to do, if I do this, then, it was conditional. If I do this, then I can go to the mall later, because all they want, as you've said in everything you write, all they want is to be with their friends again, like the octopus wants to be with his teacher. And then they stopped saying the obvious and slightly silly thing, and they started saying, like I was saying, why are you here? Not necessarily just with me. Why are you here? Mm-hmm. Why are you here? Well, What I love is being with my friends. What I love is being outside. What I love is being at the inkwells when it's really, really hot and we jump off the bridge, which is illegal, into that ice cold pool. You've done it, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm.
And you can watch them pink up like babies because no one is asking them, why are you here? What do you love?
Yes.
You know, so much is taken away from teenagers, freedom, so much. And for them to talk about what they love that remains, all I can say is they pink up and they start going, oh, wait, oh, yeah, okay, wait. And everything changes in them.
Right.
Their energy, a switch is thrown.
Right. And now they're on, the desire line,
Right.
which is in every story. Now they're on the storyline, like, I actually love this.
Yeah.
And if you're a good Sunday school teacher, you're saying, okay, then let's do more of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's where life is.
Yeah.
That's where we need to go.
Well, my kids always love stories about the bad people in the Bible because that's how you can relate. You can't relate to these kind of angelic beings who never did anything wrong and who had perfect faith under all circumstances. But what they love is like the brats, like Jonah.
Mm-hmm.
And what they love is people like the prodigal son's older brother who really sits there out on the curb bitterly outside the feast because he's so jealous and pissed off that his father has welcomed the bad boy home and has thrown a feast and killed the very best cow they had on. And they love that the brother just sits there grimly and he won't come in, he won't have any food. He's anorexic. He's not going to dance. He's not going to listen to music. He's going to sit there because he was right.
Yeah.
So,
and they're thinking like, I kind of know that brother.
And they know that. And I said
know a little bit of that. Yeah.
And I said, that's me.
Yeah, me too.
I'm the older brother.
I always wanted to be the younger brother.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Oh, I was both. Being a recovering addict and alcoholic, I was both. But I have one last question. And I could talk to you all day, but what do you hope people take away from your book? What do you hope regular old people in community, what do you hope school teachers, what do you hope community activists, what do you hope people in families, all families are troubled, what do you hope people take away from this book?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a really hard time right now. We are only given permission to live in the shallows of who we are. The communication methods we have, the way we interact with one another, the way we're told to understand ourselves, it's just in these shallows. And the young people know it, as they're coming into this world. Like my daughter and her friend said, why did you give us heroin when we were so little? And she, they're her phones, these devices. And what I hope is just to remind people, there's a whole landscape inside of you. There's a whole world inside of you. And when we sit and take the time and set the devices down and ask each other good questions, whether it's in the living room with family or friends or on a bus on a long trip or at work, we find good questions and lock it. It is a relief and a pleasure and a kind of liberation we experience that, wow, I'd like to be human. We could be human together. And then the problems that we're all facing right now, they get smaller. We can find a way through you and me, and maybe some other folks we could find in the neighborhood, and we could fix the park or heal the school or help that one family that's hungry. But it has to come from that deeper, generous place that we all hold. So that's what I hope it reminds people of, and that it's accessible, and that story is one of the ways we get there.
And like Barry Lopez said, sometimes we need a story more than we need food.
Yes.
And the culture is so based on lies, and the surface and the stories, for me, are the way home. The home to the truth, home to our heart, home to who we really have been all along. So anyway, I love you, Mark, and I love this book, and I am so glad to help you get it out into the world. So
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, friend. Thank you for this time. Yeah, I appreciate it.
Between the listening and the telling, how stories can save us.